Welcome. This is Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to spend some time talking about risk assessment, talk about the levels of risk assessment, and then we're going to spend some time taking a look at one of the control frameworks that helps us better understand risks in general as well. To help us with all of these topics related to risk and to help us better understand how to perform risk based auditing, we have Kathleen Crawford with us today. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hello, Hernan. How are you?
I am well, thank you. So, risk based auditing, and there's so much talk about the importance of being risk based as opposed to controls based and helping the organization achieve objectives and all of those things. So, central to this is understanding risk assessments. So, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, let's start off with the first graphic. The first graphic just describes what it is. So, if we think what is risk, we have to think what is risk assessment. So, risk assessments are different processes, different methods, different tools that allow us to identify risks as they relate to the goals, plans, and activities of the organization. They also are methods by which we analyze and evaluate how significant those risks are. So it's one thing to see that there's some kind of risk or some possible impediment to our accomplishment of goals, but we need to figure out how significant and, following up with that, how likely. So analyze and evaluate significance and likelihood. It further goes on to say that we are considering the impact or consequences of those risks and what that might mean to us, and how might we, this is where the rubber meets the road, how might the organization reduce, eliminate, or otherwise control those risks? We
So, we
also,
are identifying it, we are getting a sense about their magnitude and
Mhm.
likelihood, and then starting to make some decisions about what to do about those risks.
Right. Because we could wrap something up in cellophane and completely contain it, but that isn't necessarily going to be practical. A
That's right.
certain amount of risk might be necessary, and an organization may be willing to tolerate a certain proportion of risk. So
Mhm.
it's not a one size fits all approach in terms of managing risk.
Running organizations requires some risk, take some risk. Just getting out
Yes,
of bed in the morning takes some
true
risk, right?
that. True that.
So we have to decide how we are going to take it and move forward. Very good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, how likely is something? What kind of an impact would it have? Um, what will it cost us, and how will it benefit us to reduce risk to a particular level, and make those decisions around measures or actions that should be taken. So it's from beginning to end. It's starting at the beginning, thinking about what is it we're trying to accomplish, thinking about the risks to accomplishment of those plans, those goals, analyze how likely, analyze how serious the impact will be, and then determine how to reduce, eliminate, or control according to our identity, our risk appetite.
I like the fact that this is very practical. So risk is not just brainstorming scenarios and then
Mhm.
just leaving it on paper, but rather it is looking at those, analyzing those, understanding how they may affect the organization, and then deciding what to do about it in a practical sense, because you can't drive the risk to zero. There's always going to be some residual there, and that's okay. That's how we create value, but it needs to be well calculated. So as we think about these risks then and how we organize these, are there levels or layers or types?
Mhm.
How many of these are there and what are they about?
Well, I find it particularly practical to think about three levels: the enterprise level, the audit universe level, which for some of our viewers I know is going to bear a little bit of explanation, so be patient with me, I will get there, and then the audit project level. So, the enterprise level, think about this as a giant SWOT analysis. The organization as a whole will reach out to different departments and processes and functional areas to get a better understanding of what risks are most relevant to them, both in the context of the external environment and within the context of the resources that we have, the time, the human capital, what objectives we have. So enterprise risk assessment is something that should be undertaken, I would say, at least on an annual basis to revisit assumptions, to make sure that there's a strong understanding of what strengths and weaknesses internally can affect the organization and what opportunities and threats externally might affect the organization.
So this includes the senior management of the organization, I would imagine, maybe
Mm-hmm.
even the board, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they'll have that high level understanding of what's happening in the industry, even in the economy in many cases. So what's happening in the economy at large that may impact the industry, and what's happening within the industry that may affect the organization and where the organization is trying to go. Is
Yes,
that correct?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
And I know that it involves one of your favorite words, which is strategy. Where are they
Yes.
going? What are they trying to do? How likely, how easily, with what amount of difficulty would it take to go from point A to B all the way to Z, depending on what they're trying to accomplish in their marketplace, in their brand, with the resources that they have.
Okay. All right. Very good. That makes sense. And how about the next one in terms of what the role of audit is as relates to this and the next tier?
Right. So we have two parts that belong to audit. First is the audit universe level. That's at the center of that cascade that we saw. It's important for us to either be part of or somehow piggyback onto the enterprise level risk assessment. So, as you said, if executive leadership is reaching out to all of their direct reports to gather business intelligence as to the risks and as well as the opportunities, we want to know the strengths and weaknesses that we possess internally, the opportunities and threats externally, and what does that mean in terms of where we're going, as you said. So, with regard to our piece of this, we want to be part of the mix, maybe not influencing it in any way, but being a recipient of that information so that we can have a better understanding of how that might change the trajectory of our own plans in terms of what we would like to audit over, say, the next year or so. This is an
Okay.
important thing to factor in too.
So that we are focusing on auditing what matters most to the organization and what's most relevant so that we're not just auditing out there because
Yes.
we just have this idea, but rather we know what's happening with the feedback we're getting from the organization and their sense of direction so we can focus our efforts where it's going to have the greatest impact on the organization.
Yes. And it would not be out of line if we were somehow a collection mechanism or a repository for some of that information that's coming in at the behest of senior leadership. We might be
Mhm.
able to get a peek at this before it goes to them and they do with it whatever they do in terms of making their decisions. So it is well within bounds of independence and objectivity to have some small role to play in the ERM process in an administrative way, not to influence it, but to kind of put our fingers on the pulse of what is showing up.
And this will also be consistent with another expression that's very common in the profession these days, and that is becoming a trusted advisor.
Hmm.
So, by understanding what the organization's goals are and where they are managing dynamics that can be troublesome to the achievement of those goals and the strategies and so on, they can then say, okay, what do you think, Mr. Auditor? And how can we stay clear of risks that could derail our efforts to get someplace? So that makes sense, makes a lot of sense. So what about the third tier or the third type?
So the third area is the audit project level. Now, this intersects with the audit universe in an important way. At the audit universe, we're setting our expectations in terms of a time horizon, usually of about a year, perhaps a little bit more, perhaps a little bit less. But we've given some consideration to whether or not we have what do we have in terms of the resources to do what we need to do. When we get to the audit project level, we'll see it coming, generally speaking. Occasionally, we might have a surprise audit to do, something that hadn't been considered in the audit universe but has risen to the top because of some level of significance. But for the most part, the audit project was something that we expected to do. It was put into the audit universe for the year, and now it has arrived. What needs to happen here in terms of risk assessment is to determine whether or not our assumptions at the audit universe level are still valid. So we don't want to just presume that they are and launch into planning without some further risk assessment. So we're going to still look at strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats as relates to the process, system, or functional area that we're going to audit.
Okay, great. So it seems to me like we're looking at both strategically and tactically. We're also looking from the whole organization level, and then we're drilling down a bit of a funnel approach, enterprise, and then we're looking at how it affects internal audit and how internal audit is going to take that knowledge and move forward with it and schedule it according to the resources. And then we have at the project level, very tactical now. So what are the individual auditors now going to do with this information, and how are they going to verify that the mechanism established in that area has been put in place effectively, is running the way it's supposed to, and then identify any areas for improvement. Is that generally speaking how these three elements work together and how they cascade and information flows from the top down? Is that generally
Yeah,
speaking how it
yeah.
works?
And I'm glad you picked
Okay.
up on the cascade because that is what visually we were trying to depict there is that there is a relationship and it does flow from the top to the middle to the bottom.
Excellent. Okay. Very good. That helps us understand it much better. As far as guidance and framework that can help us better understand this and so on. I know COSO has been very influential in our profession, providing a lot of guidance. COSO ERM comes to mind.
Mhm.
What can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, COSO ERM, COSO Enterprise Risk Management, is also another model that the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations put out, and it directly applies to um, the risk universe, but in a much, much more contextual way. So, focus first on the mission, the vision, and the core values of the organization, then move into strategy development, then move into business objectives and their formulation. So how does an organization set its objectives for performance? Then finally, or second to last rather, we're looking at the implementation and performance. And then finally, being certain or assessing whether or not all of that effort, all of that thinking, all of that action has produced the enhanced value that the organization hopes that it will.
So when people are looking around the organization or the website and they see value statement, mission statement, some people may be inclined to think, well, what is that all about? Maybe just trendy, nice to have. Everybody else has it, so we should too. But what Coase is basically saying that there's a connection between this mission, vision, values, and how
Mhm.
you set strategy and how you build all of these elements. And then at the end, we see where it starts clearly about adding value. So this is how the organization is going to then take that ambition, that aspiration, if you will, what
Mhm.
value statements and mission statements generally are all about, and transform it into value creation. So that is interesting to make that connection and show that it's again pragmatic, it's practical, it leads to value creation for everyone. So that's very important to see that so visually
Mhm.
presented. In terms of organization of these elements, then looks like there are groupings of some of the principles that are behind this. But what are those groupings anyway that help us better understand how these things kind of have a logical arrangement?
Sure. Well, when we think about mission and vision and core values, I think governance and culture. Underneath governance and culture, we have five different elements that we might look at. The
Okay.
context of culture, I think, is an interesting thing to reflect on, given what you just talked about. That I know you know that I worked in banking for many years, and I worked for a lot of different types of banks, from a small community bank to a pretty sizable investment bank. And so the
Mhm.
cultures and the strategies they were worlds apart from each other, but each
Yeah.
each was faithful to their own stakeholders' expectations because of the hard work of building a culture and being certain that that culture was going to be attractive to all of their stakeholders, both internal ones and external ones.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, culture is unique to each organization and is very interesting. And if you've worked for more than one organization, you already experienced it.
Hmm.
I refer to it as what's it like working here? And every organization has its own characteristics and those details different from one to the other. So, what are some of the other groupings that COSO ERM lays out for us?
Well, if you take a look at the schematic here, we're also thinking in the realm of strategy, of direction, of planning, as we move from the issues of governance and culture into this second area. So, strategy development is underpinned with four different areas of concern, and the you notice that the little graphic has gears, the relationship and the gears to keep the strategy moving forward as envisioned by management and as supported by the core values of the organization.
Building on what you said earlier about the different banks and how they differ, right? There's a difference in terms of culture, but generally speaking, there's also a difference in terms of risk appetite and risk
Certainly.
tolerance and how they're going to go about prioritizing the use of resources and what endeavors they're going to pursue. So that's also interesting that it's reflected in that particular section as well. And like you mentioned, the gears, I think that's very helpful as well to think in terms of, okay, we have been doing a lot of thinking in terms of governance and structure. What do we do with this? So
Right.
the gears are very illustrative of that. What's the next one?
The next one is performance. So, how does the organization perform in a way that is consistent with its mission and its vision, as well as how it has set up a particular strategy? Actually, this reminds me, as we look at performance, this reminds me of a story that I heard also in a banking context with a chair and CEO of a very well known bank, which shall remain nameless, that opted not to pursue securitized mortgages, which got a lot of banks into difficulty. And
Yes.
his rationale was that it was a very complex area of business. It was so complex that even he, as someone who had been in banking for most of his adult life, did not
Mhm.
want his organization to pursue. And I found the story interesting because he stuck to that decision. He stuck to that principle, notwithstanding some of his colleagues were saying, "But look at there's profit here." I don't care. We're not going to do it. And in fact, his wisdom proved to be very, very prescient. They were one of the few banks that did not suffer some of the consequences that their competitors did.
Right. Yes, it was definitely a very trendy thing, but also extremely risky.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of institutions paid dearly because of it.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
But what are I mean, like if we're thinking about performance, what are the kinds of things that leap out at you as you look at a list like this?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of different things about how organizations execute,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of it is how they see risk and how the organization. And we go back to culture and strategy and how we put it all together with risk appetite and how we look at risk in terms of identification of risk and measuring of risk, and then deciding how you're going to respond to it, but also looking at it from a portfolio view. So you may have some risks that on the surface is just happening here or there in a few isolated places, but if you look at it in the aggregate, you realize that these things create a big exposure. And in some organizations, this can really add up to the point where once you understand that you have a lot of exposure there because of these dynamics, you probably want to take action. So individually, they may seem low, but in the aggregate, they may actually be medium or high risks. And then you are going to come up with a different way of handling those risks, and your response will be different because of that portfolio view of risk. So that's an important thing to also keep in mind.
Well, and when
So
you
this
think
is
about that too, then the auditors have to also be mindful of the fact that there may be sprinkled over here some of that, and there may be others
mhm,
over here. And so not to just take um, to take a bird's eye view as opposed to a worm's eye view of what's going on in any given area.
Right. Yeah, I think of it also as every audit. In many cases, you can think of it as kind of having a vertical
Mhm.
perspective to it. So you do an audit in this area, this area, this area. But if you look across, you may start to see commonalities
Yeah.
and how some of these dynamics can also escalate. And we used to refer to them as global issues or global
Mhm.
findings because maybe you identify these dynamics in different places. But when you step back and you look at it in the aggregate, you say, oh, wait a second, this looks
Yeah.
like that, this looks like the other, and you realize there's a commonality, and now you treat it as a global issue and you bring it to management's attention. And in many cases, they were not aware of it. So they found it to be very helpful that we were able to bring that message back to them and alert them to something that was potentially going to become a big issue for them.
And there's
So as
that
we look
trusted
at
business advisor you talked about. Trusted business advisor.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So then we have the implementation of the framework and the different actions that this begs for. So what are some of the things that happen as we look at that in terms of looking at change? I think that change is such an important dynamic these days. And as we think about just the fact that it's happening and people refer to it as the new normal, but it is definitely something that is going to differentiate some organizations that are going to have a lot of problems, even have potentially catastrophic consequences brought upon them because they are not able to embrace change
Mhm.
and to be, like we say, the ability to mobilize their resources accordingly so that they can capitalize on it and create value from change. So, change enablement has become an interesting term. And as auditors, we may want to take a look at that. Don't you agree?
Oh, I do agree. And in fact, as you were talking about that, I was reminded of an organization that served people with disabilities who received benefit income. Over years, incrementally, they started taking on more and more and more of that role and found that not everyone really understood as well as they could have or should have all of the responsibilities associated with the regulations around that. So
Uh-huh.
this was an organization that was regional and had pockets of programs where they were administering small portfolios of information of money, and unintentionally violating some of the rules of the practice. So, but they realized this is somewhat similar to what you were saying, is that it was brought to their attention by internal audit that they needed to review their practices and make some changes. This was a very well intentioned group that was motivated to make the necessary changes, and they underwent a pretty substantial reevaluation of how to carry out the practice, making some tough decisions in some cases, but ultimately serving the people that needed to be served effectively and within the boundaries of the law.
Yes. Yeah, it's very important to learn from other organizations and what worked well, what didn't work as well, and how we can avoid making the same mistakes. In terms of the ERM framework, as we get to the last three principles, talks about leveraging information
Mhm.
technology, talks about communication and communicating risk details, and also it interesting how it bookends talking about culture again and performance. So it brings us back to systems, communications, and culture. What are some of the things that come out to the surface as you think about these three principles?
Well, I think I would say that most thinking, if we really analyze it, is systems thinking. What relates to what? What is the scale of different challenges that an organization is facing? How does that impact culture? Or conversely, how does culture impact our willingness to recognize that we're in an evolutionary pattern and we have to change with the times? So I would say culture is paramount, but also is having a clear-eyed vision and expectation that everybody else has a clear-eyed vision that the past is the past, the present is the present, and if we want to grow and move into the future, we have to be willing to confront what's working, what isn't working, what puts us at risk, and to put the proper protections in place to make it more possible that we can move into our envisioned future.
This is great to have that perspective on these elements related to risk and enterprise risk management. And as we talk about culture, there's an expression, right, that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yeah.
So any day, I believe this, the quote is actually any day. So if you prefer lunch or dinner, you can just replace the word there for your favorite meal.
Mhm.
But culture plays an important role, and increasingly internal auditors are auditing culture and ethics and things like that. So these soft topics that are so important to the success of an organization. So thank you, Kathleen. It was very helpful that we had you here to talk about these topics and get a better appreciation for what risk assessment is all about, the different tiers or levels of risk, and then also taking a closer look at COSO ERM and the wealth of information that is captured in that framework. So thank you very much.
It is my pleasure. Thank you, Hanan.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit related content.